Welcome to the Janome Studio. In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do a flanged binding. Okay, so now we're ready to jump into our flanged binding. And whenever you create a flanged binding, you actually need two different fabrics. So you're going to have a main fabric, which is the fabric that shows up the most right here, this teal color. And you've got an accent fabric, which is this really cool looking fabric that's white with the little teal pops. And all that's going to show on the accent fabric is about 1/8 of an inch on the very edge of the inside of the binding. So what we're going to do to prepare our binding is we're going to cut strips of both the main and the accent fabric. The main fabric we're going to cut at 1.5 inches wide, and the accent fabric strips we're going to cut at 1 3/4 inches wide. And so you'll need to cut enough to equal the perimeter of your quilt plus 10 inches to give you just a little bit of wiggle room. And once you've cut those strips, you're going to join the pieces of your binding separately. So you'll sew your main pieces together end to end, and then you'll sew your accent pieces together end to end so that you've got two separate pieces of binding. Once you do that, you're going to match these together. So you'll have your accent fabric and your main fabric. You'll have those right sides together and match one of the raw edges. And then you're going to sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way through the length. Once you've done that, you're going to press the seam towards the main fabric, so towards the narrower piece. And then you're going to fold them in half and match the raw edges. So once you've done that, on one side, you'll be able to see the main fabric and the little pop of color from the accent fabric. When you flip it over, you'll only see the accent fabric. So this turquoise color is the front of our quilt. We're actually going to start from the back of our quilt. So the darker blue color is the back of my quilt. And I'm going to take my flanged binding pieces and I'm going to position them so that the accent is facing up. And only the accent. So whenever I flip it over, it's going to show the main and the accent. So just always make sure when you're doing a flanged binding that only the accent is facing up against the back of the quilt. And we're going to go ahead and open this piece out all the way. And we're going to make a cut at a 45-degree angle. And we're doing this to create a little sleeve to tuck the end of our binding into for an easy and quick finish. So once we've made this cut, we're going to go ahead and fold down the edge of that cut piece by about 3/8 of an inch. So that's going to conceal the raw edge of the fabric and create that little sleeve that we're going to tuck into in just a moment. And we're going to trim away this little piece that's overhanging. All right, perfect. And now we're going to clip just a few inches of this beginning of the flanged piece while it's open. And we'll go to the sewing machine and sew 4 to 5 inches of a straight stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we'll stop just below where this binding clip is. Then we're going to cut our threads and we'll actually fold the binding back over. And then we'll begin sewing all the way around our binding through all the layers starting below our stopping point. Okay, so now we're ready to sew our flanged binding pieces down to the back of our quilt. I've got my binding opened out and I've got my 1/4 inch foot on. So we need to go ahead and navigate to the 1/4 inch stitch, which is under the quilt menu, and it's the second stitch that says 1/4 inch. So we're gonna go ahead and remove these first couple of binding clips. We're gonna move the folded edge of the flanged binding so that it's under the presser foot. And then we're gonna do the needle down and bring it back up to bring our bobbin thread to the top. And then we'll do it again And we're gonna sew backwards just a couple of stitches to secure our stitches in place. Perfect, just like that. Okay, so now we're gonna sew for 4 to 5 inches. And what we're doing is we're creating a little sleeve that we're gonna be tucking the tail of our binding in for whenever we finish our binding. Go ahead and do a lock stitch. That'll secure your threads and trim your fabric at the same time. Perfect. Okay, so now I'm gonna trim these little threads up here, and I'm gonna fold my flanged binding over so that the accent is the only thing facing up, making sure that this folded edge is folded whenever I'm folding it down. We're gonna start sewing just below where we left off. So I'm gonna put a binding clip there just for reference so you can see where I'm positioning the fabric. So I'm gonna move that, come down a little bit, perfect right there. So I'm gonna put the presser foot down to save my spot, and now I'm gonna put the needle in the down position. I'm bringing up the bobbin thread. Just like that. Do it again, and now I'm gonna sew backwards just a couple of stitches to secure my threads. Perfect. Okay, and now you're gonna continue putting this on just as you would a standard binding, mitering the corners as you go. So before we get to this corner, I'm gonna mark where the edge of my quilt is, and I'm actually gonna be sewing off of the fabric at a diagonal. This is gonna help me perfectly miter my corners. So this is where I'm gonna be sewing. Let's go ahead and do that. 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna engage the pivot feature. And so next time I stop sewing, it'll automatically lift the presser foot. So I'm gonna continue sewing right off the edge of the quilt. And now I'm gonna trim my threads. Perfect, just like that. Now I'm gonna manipulate the fabric so that I make a little triangle, and I'm just gonna fold this fabric over on itself so that I've got these two pieces meeting and standing up like that, like a little tent. And then I'm gonna fold it down towards what I just sewed. I'm gonna go ahead and mark the diagonal because I'm gonna be sewing from off the fabric onto the quilt. Perfect, and stop sewing so that the pivot lifts the presser foot up. And now we're gonna continue sewing our 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around until we've attached the flanged binding all the way around the quilt. Okay, so now that we have sewed almost all the way around back to where we started our flanged binding, we're gonna slow down a little bit, and what we need to do is I'm stopping 1 to 2 inches before where I started, and I'm gonna overlap the end piece with our starting piece. And I'm gonna come down here and I'm gonna cut just above where my starting stitch was previously. So I'm gonna come and cut that. And I'm gonna tuck that into the little sleeve that we made. So this is a really great way to finish your quilt binding, and that folded over edge means you don't have any raw edges to worry about. It's a really great, quick and easy way to finish your binding. So we have that tucked in. I'm gonna go ahead and sew until I get back to my starting stitches. Now before I get to this folded edge, I'm gonna go ahead and smooth this down one more time. You can definitely use binding clips to hold it, or if you're more comfortable, you can use your fingers. Just make sure that once you approach this folded edge with your presser foot, that you kind of babysit it, because if you let this go, the presser foot could catch the folded edge and flip it down, and you definitely don't want that to happen. So make sure that that goes under the presser foot and not on top of it. Okay, smooth that down a little bit. And then we're just gonna finish off our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Perfect. So we'll do a lock stitch, and that's gonna secure our stitches and cut our threads. Okay, so now that we're at the ironing table, I'm gonna show you how to press the edges of your binding so that all of the edges turn out really nice and crisp. So I'm starting from the back side of the quilt, and now I'm gonna kind of finger press these, the sewn down edge of the binding out away from the quilt on the long straight edges. So I'm gonna give that a good press. And I'm gonna do that all the way around the quilt, and I'm leaving the corners alone for right now. I'm gonna deal with that whenever I flip this over to the right side of the quilt. And you can definitely use a spray starch if you'd like to, if that's something that you're used to using and you prefer to use that. That's totally fine to use, but it's not necessary, just personal preference. Okay, so we've pressed these edges. Now I'm gonna flip it over to the right side of the quilt, and we're gonna kind of go ahead and fold this down by hand. And what I'm doing is I'm poking the little pointed parts of the quilt out into those mitered corners that we made previously. So now I'm gonna start at the top of the quilt, and I'm gonna be pressing this down, and I'm gonna press from left to right, and I'm gonna start about, I don't know, a quarter of the way in from the edge of the quilt, and I'm gonna iron all the way down so that this makes like a little triangle over here. And I'm gonna press that down. As you press, you're gonna wanna probably put binding clips on, just so that your pressing stays nice and neat. So I'm gonna throw a couple of binding clips on here. And now I'm gonna start pressing over here from the bottom edge about 3/4 of the way down. I'm folding that folded edge all the way over, and I'm gonna make sure that my corners are nice and mitered. And what that means is the edges of both of these pieces of fabric, when they meet, they match perfectly and form a 45-degree angle to the corner really nicely. And I'm gonna clip that in place first and foremost before I clip anything else, so that stays put. And that's really it. You're just gonna continue to do that all the way around the edges of the quilt until you've got all of your binding pressed in place and clipped. And then we'll be ready to head to the sewing machine to top stitch our binding down. I've got my standard foot, or foot A, attached to the Memory Craft 15,000, and I need to navigate back to the utility menu and choose number 1 or the straight stitch. And if for some reason you've changed your settings, you can always hit the default button at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and it'll change the stitch back to its original setting. Now, before we start top stitching this binding down, I'm gonna go ahead and change my bobbin thread because I want it to match this pretty blue color of the back of my quilt so that it really blends in and you can't see the stitches. So I picked a nice matching thread. Loaded that in. Okay, and I generally like to start where we tucked our binding into the little sleeve. So I'm gonna start just above that, and I'm gonna be stitching in the ditch. So what stitching in the ditch is, I'm actually gonna be stitching kind of in the seam line between the accent piece and the main piece. That's just my personal preference. If you want to, you can top stitch really close to the folded edge of the accent piece. I just like to stitch in the ditch because it gives a little bit more of, it makes the flange look a little more obvious and intentional. And I just like the effect that it has. So it's just personal preference. And I'm gonna go ahead and bring my bobbin thread up. Put my needle back down, and I'm gonna stitch backwards just a couple of stitches to secure my threads. Perfect. I'm gonna bring those threads under the foot, and I'm gonna start top stitching all the way around this binding. And I'm starting before my little tucked in pocket because I just like to get that secured in the beginning so I don't forget about it. And I know it's coming up right away and I can slow down and plan for that. You want to try as hard as you can to make the flanged pieces meet up. So you can see that these are a little bit off center. I'm gonna just manipulate that with my fingers a little bit so that those two accent pieces match up. There we go, that looks just about perfect. Okay, and then once we get to the corners, we're gonna just make those mitered corners kind of kiss. So we're gonna stitch through to that. Okay, and then now I'm going to rotate, and then I'm just gonna continue top stitching all the way around the perimeter of the quilts. Now that you've seen how to attach a flanged binding, I hope that you'll try it out on your next project so you can showcase a nice little pop of color on the edge of your binding.